Hi, today we're going to talk about the episode The Old Sugarman Place, which is one of the most important and rich episodes in the entire series. Like Fish Out of Water, I really think it needs its own lecture because it has so many layers to it and it's so complicated. Also, you should notice that it basically forms a kind of a two-parter with the episode Time's Arrow that comes later in this season, and which I will also devote a lecture to. Before I get to the Old Sugarman Place, though, I actually wanted to make a point left over from the last lecture that I didn't think to make at the time. If you remember in the last lecture, I was talking about, among other things, myth-making and family roles. I was talking about how one of the ways that families form identities, both as a family and for the people in that family, is by attributing specific roles to members of that family that are typically exaggerated to some extent and overly neat. So one sibling becomes the messy one, or one sibling becomes the badly behaved one, or the well-behaved one. And these kinds of family mythologies help tell a story of family and give people a particular identity in the family. And they can be harmful, but they can also do a lot of work of imaginative work to make the family have the identity it has. Now, one of the examples of this that I didn't think to mention and should have is Hollyhock's 8 Dads. There's a very exaggerated version of this for the 8 Dads, right? Each dad has his thing. One of them is the film guy, one of them is the duck who quacks, and so forth. And part of the way that family works is through this exaggerated story where each dad has his own persona and his own role as part of the family mythology. So I thought that was a nice touch. Okay, to move on to the Old Sugarman Place. We've been talking about family and fantasy, and we see those themes here. But we also see themes that we saw earlier in the series to do with personal identity and our origins, and questions about how we are and aren't shaped by our own past and where we came from. We also see Camus-like themes about finding meaning in work regardless of its purpose, and the way that working on a project can give us identity and meaning even if that project doesn't come to anything. It also asks, I think, difficult questions about the role of memory in identity and the role of history that we might not even remember in our identity. So what happens in this episode? Well, after Sarah Lynn's death, Bojack leaves Los Angeles to find himself. We've seen him do this before, right? He has escaped LA and tried to find a place where he can root his identity, like when he went to visit Charlotte. This time he goes to his family's summer home. And an interesting question you should ask is why? Why is that the location he picks, especially given how abusive his childhood was and how vexed he feels about his parents? What is he trying to find there? When we get to the house, it's fairly clear that the space of the house functions as a kind of an externalized version of Bojack himself, right? This is true in numerous ways. It's true metaphorically in the sense that clearly Bojack is sort of treating the house as a version of himself to work on. But I think it also works visually in the sense that the house serves as a visual metaphor for Bojack himself. It's filled with random, broken, nonsensical bits of his own past. As he walks around through it, he keeps falling through the floor and crashing down, right? The house has no integrity when he first gets there. It's not solid. And this seems to be pretty obviously a way of visually portraying what's going on with Bojack's own sense of self and his own identity in the inside of his own head. This metaphor has its roots in Freud, by the way. Freud argued that if you dream that you're in a house or a building and that you're wandering around that house, especially if it's a home, then that house represents your own inner life and your own mental state, and the organization of the house in your dream and what you find in the house is a way of externalizing the organization of your own mind and what's going on in your own mind. Whether or not you think that that's a good analysis from the point of view of empirical psychology, it's obviously within the show a powerful way of exploring the state of Bojack's mind. So the house is chaotic, it's broken, it doesn't come together, and it's clearly haunted by its past stories, just as Bojack is. And we see the things that happened there in the past replay themselves in the house. At first, it just looks like two timelines, so it goes back and forth between when Bojack is in the house and when his mom and grandparents were in the house. But by the end of the episode, the two timelines are overlapping with one another, and so the past timeline really becomes like a haunting of the present timeline. And of course, these past stories are, by implication, still part of Bojack, even if he wasn't there for them. How do they help form him if he wasn't there for them? Well, the show actually gives us an answer to that interesting question, right? Which is that patterns and stories and traumas from the past get passed down through generations and help knit together a family. This happens in some very concrete ways, right? Like cycles of child abuse repeat themselves. We know empirically that this is true, that people will often recreate cycles of abuse from their childhood. We know that concretely trauma can get passed down when people carry with them their past trauma and impart them to their children. But here we see both the literal and the metaphorical versions of this, right? The stories of the past shape the characters' futures, and then in turn those characters treat new characters in new ways. I'm sorry, I didn't say that very clearly, but the point is, when we learn what happened in, for example, Beatrice's past, Bojack's mother's past, we understand much better the meaning of the things that she says to Bojack later on. And in turn, of course, Bojack was formed in part through how he was treated by his mother and the things his mother said to him. So here we get to understand how his mother's own past stories that he wasn't there for directly help shape who he is. And in turn, going back to the theme of the last lecture, these stories knit together his family and give it an identity as a family. So for example, let me find the exact quote that I want to find for you here for a moment. Right. For example, the grandmother says to Beatrice after she loses Crackerjack, she says, "Love does things to a person, terrible things. Promise you'll never love anyone as much as I loved Crackerjack." So first of all, that's an incredibly powerful thing for your mother to say for you. That would be very traumatic. But the important point is she doesn't, right? Beatrice does, for the rest of her life, never love anyone as much as her mother loved Crackerjack. She takes that lesson to heart. And so in this moment, we see a root of her coldness and her refusal to show love. Instead of it just being a feature of her given character, that she's just like built in a way that she's incapable of love, we realize that that lack of love has a very specific history and that it's been transmitted through stories that cross generations. And of course, that lack of love has seriously impacted Bojack. So one of the things we learn here is that oftentimes things that just look like stable given character traits are in fact products of very specific histories, and we can make narrative sense out of them. We also here have Bojack say that he is the last of his line, right? He has no kids, and so he's there exploring this ancestral tissue of family stories that goes back for generations, but he takes himself to be the end of it. So if we're thinking of his family in narrative terms, then he is the end of a narrative. But, of course, ironically, he says this right before he meets Hollyhock. And it turns out that he's not the last of his line, but he doesn't know that when he says it. So on the one hand, when he says that, we're learning something important about how he conceives of his family narrative. And on the other hand, it's an important foreshadowing of this new plot line that's about to come, where his family story is going to continue through Hollyhock. So Bojack's grandmother loses her son in the war. And this is clearly, we find out in this episode, the defining trauma for the whole family, which in an important way shapes everything else that happens in that family after that, all the way down to Bojack and his problems with addiction and his identity crises and so forth. And when she loses her son, what she really needs is to find a way to make sense of who she is after that loss and to grieve properly. Her identity was clearly totally wrapped up in being a mother to Crackerjack. He's clearly her favorite. She adores him, and she clearly understands who she is and why she's there in the world, importantly through her relationship to this son. So when she loses the son, who is she? She feels like she's lost her identity as a mother. And of course, that's especially difficult for Beatrice because she's also Beatrice's mother, but she loses sight of that because she just feels like her identity as a mother has been broken. So Beatrice ends up pretty directly unmothered, which is important. But anyway, she loses her identity, and this is clearly just maximally traumatic to her. And what she really needs is the room to figure out how she feels and who she is in light of this and to rebuild her identity. But Bojack's grandfather, her husband, is a cruel misogynist who doesn't allow her this. And this is super important to how the rest of the story goes. His grandfather only allows women around him to have any agency at all as an act of generosity on his part. He does not allow them to have their own identity, and in particular, he does not allow them to show or work through their feelings. He's explicit about that, right? He says, I have no ability to cope with women's emotions, and I don't intend to learn. But this is really literal in the sense that he punishes his wife, Beatrice's mother, for grieving. And ultimately, when she won't stop grieving, instead of letting her build a new identity and feel her feelings, he does the exact opposite. He has her lobotomized, and he has half of her brain surgically removed. So she literally loses her identity and literally loses her ability to feel. Early on in the episode, when they're dancing around flirtatiously before Crackerjack dies, the grandmother says, I've got half a mind to kiss you with that mouth. And the grandfather says back, well, that half you can keep. Boy, is that a telling line, right? On the one hand, it's a foreshadowing of what later becomes terrifyingly real, that he really does literally only let her keep half of her mind. He forces the other half to be cut out. But also, it's just such a revealing line as to his attitude towards the women around him, that they get to have agency and decision-making powers only if he gives it to them as a favor, right? She's allowed to have her motives and her desire and her mind because he lets her. I mean, he says it flirtatiously, but if you think about it, it's just a horrible thing to say to somebody, to give them the impression that you're the one who gets to decide if they have their own mind or not. And he does this to his daughter too, right? He controls her. He actually kind of fails to control her. So one of the things we learn about Beatrice in this episode and in Time's Arrow is that she's actually much, much, much stronger than we knew until now. Her father, for all his efforts, does not manage to completely co-opt her agency or to control her, and she does, to a large extent, do her own thing, but no thanks to her father, right? Her father deeply tries to control every aspect of her existence, who she marries, what she does, how she feels, and very tellingly, he tries to control exactly what she eats and what her body looks like. It's an incredibly invasive kind of disciplining of her bodily practices. He fat shames her in this episode, and also in Time's Arrow, he fat shames her mercilessly, which is bad in its own right, but he controls whether or not she's allowed to eat ice cream, and just in general, he tries to discipline and control her eating. If you think about it, eating and the body are such intimate personal activities. To have somebody else discipline and control them, and to tell you what you are and aren't allowed to eat, and how your body must look and be shaped, is one of the most invasive, agency undermining things that you can possibly do to someone. And this really gets at the root of his fundamental undermining of her agency, both just directly, because this is a way of undermining her agency, and I think it also serves as a nice metaphor throughout the show for the ways in which he controls her. And of course, we see that his disciplining of her eating basically gives her a disordered attitude towards eating, which is also one of these things that gets passed on from generation to generation. She gives her disordered eating patterns to Bojack, who's going to struggle with substance abuse and consumption issues for his entire life. And then later, very tragically, she passes on her disordered eating issues to Hollyhock, who she slips diet pills to and almost kills because she tries to control her body in the most invasive possible way. So this is another example of generational narratives that weave from generation to generation. Okay, so that was a bit of a detour back to where we were, though. What we see here then is Beatrice's mother lose her agency through her loss of Cracker Jack, as facilitated and enforced by her husband. And we see the way that that loss of agency creates a trauma that is going to shape the family for all the generations yet to come. Okay, I'm going to pause there and move on to a slightly different topic.